We're going to continue our study in Corinthians. Now, we had an interesting beginning of the chapter last week in our discussion. And really, just to kind of summarize the point of where we had gone last week, the possible situation in Corinth seemed to be that in times of public gatherings, public worship services, there were those of the congregation that were involved in acts of worship that by their appearance, and I think that, once again, remember the elements that we pointed to. He's talking about public worship. And the issue was that in public worship, by their appearance, some in the congregation were given the message or implying that Christianity was just like other pagan beliefs. Remember, Paul talked about having the head veiled as a man, having the head unveiled as a woman. Both of those having related to one for the covering of man's head. That's how they would often do it in their pagan worship. They would put a veil, or else they would have really long hair they would drape over. And evidently some were doing this in the worship services. And Paul is saying, you're giving the impression that Christianity is just like the pagan religion. And that is not honoring your head, verse 5, which is, or verse 4, the head being Christ. And the woman having her head uncovered in that area, and during that time pretty much over the Middle Eastern areas, women who were married wore a veil. It was a public message that she was a married woman. And there were some, evidently, within Corinth that were removing their veil. And not that there was anything wrong with removing the veil, except for the fact that by their appearance they were sending mixed messages that they were women that were interested in being unfaithful. So Paul is addressing the testimony. He's not talking about the length of hair, the shortness of hair, because there's never any length or any designation of what equals long or what equals short. So he's not looking so much at the length of hair, but really what the message was being sent by it in their public worship situations. So by their appearance, they were showing, or they were implying, we can put it that way, implying that Christianity was just like the other pagan religions, and they were implying that the expected order in the sense of unity, order in the sense of this was expectations, that order for females was not important to Christianity. And Paul is saying, that's not what you want to present. You don't want to present that gender issues, marriage issues are unimportant to Christianity. He said you don't want to do that. You don't want to imply that to people who are coming into your congregation. Whether they would be weak Christians or people who have a lot of scruples about this, because just like eating food dedicated to idols, they hadn't been able to grow in their knowledge to the place of feeling and understanding the freedom that they had. And at the same time, either the weak in that sense, or people that were lost that would come in and see, okay, well, You're doing some of the same things that we do in the pagan temple, so what's the difference? Why should I worry about coming to your congregation when I can do the same thing that you're doing? I've been doing it all along, and you're telling me that this Jesus is different. It's not looking like it. So that power of the first impression, we would call it, is what Paul is addressing. This was a distraction to the point of worship. So Paul is pointing this out, and I think this is really the essence of what Paul is addressing in this section. Now, we had some good discussion last week. Any question or point of clarification before we move on? I take that everybody is just as confused now as they were last week. Okay, we'll move right along. So, picking up in verse 7, New International Version, a man ought not to cover his head, since he is the image and glory of God. But the woman is the glory of man. For man did not come from woman, but woman from man. Neither was man created for woman, but woman for man. For this reason, and because of the angels, the woman ought to have a sign of authority on her head. Now, this section of Scripture can be very difficult to understand. And from the study that I did, it was obvious that a lot of commentators had some difficulties with it as well. And it's very easy to read these verses and just read it as a hierarchy of supremacy, in which, some men have believed and have taught, some churches have, and many women have been led to feel that idea of a supremacy and inferiority, looking at it from that standpoint. But this isn't the case that Paul is bringing out here. Paul's citing of the Genesis account of the creation of man is noting that man was created first by God and then woman from man, and they together are the glory of one another. He's not looking at dominance, supremacy versus inferiority or lesser. Somebody had to come first. God created man first. Out of man came woman. And he's simply noting that. And that both of them together, are to glorify each other, and that both together bear the image of God. Paul said, Moses wrote in Genesis 1:27 that all humanity bears the image of God. In the image of God, he created him. Male and female, he created them. So, Paul is not talking about a hierarchy here. But since the woman came from the man, Paul is simply saying that the woman was given an added responsibility, if you will, of being created both for God and for man. And once again, when we talk about for man, here was another one of those aspects that we looked at, one of the keys that we need to understand. We need to understand man in this context as husband, and woman as wife. I think it makes it much easier to understand this passage of Scripture, this section of chapter 11, if we have this understanding. Otherwise, to try to read into it that all men are superior to all women, and that all women are to glorify all men. Okay, what does that mean? How does that look? How can that even happen? It creates more confusion than it does solve anything. So I think we need to look at this really from the standpoint of understanding man, husband, woman, wife. So this sense of added responsibility of being created both for God and man is not a sense of servitude, as in lesser, but as part of the service of who you are as a woman versus who we are as men. Not a lesser or better or greater understanding. It's not that at all. the essence of who we are as men and women are equal. He created us male and female. What Genesis 1:27. We all bear the image of God, men as well as women. So in that sense, as far as who we are, we're equal. As far as what our functions are in life, that is different. It's not about better or best, good or greater. It's about different. It's not about that. It's just like, there's a commercial, and I don't even know what they're advertising, really. But there's this lady who comes on and says something to the effect that women are just unique. We grow babies. We run businesses. We do, yeah. Yeah. And I think part of what they're talking about is the great responsibility and ability of women in that role. So it's not talking great, less, more, better, it's not looking at it from that standpoint.
Bill?
Yes, sir.
What Paul was trying to tell them because they was fussing and arguing about that?
Yeah, I think there was a real sense of arrogance, which has come up several times before in Corinth. There was a sense of arrogance that some of the members had, that because they were now believers and free, not under the law, which is true, that they could do anything they wanted, whether it hurt another believer's feelings, whether it was not a real good testimony. They just felt like they could still do that. And there was contention, and there was conflict within the congregation at Corinth over this. Paul's going to get into it later on in this chapter as he starts talking about the Lord's Supper. They were even having problems over this. Problems being there was people who were eating to being just simply pigged out, and some were getting drunk in the celebration of the Lord's Supper. So there was an arrogance, there was a sense that they felt they could do whatever they wanted, and it was okay. Paul is saying, yes, everything is permissible, but not everything is constructive. He's trying to bring some balance to this. And think about your testimony. Think about how you treat other believers, because Paul says you start wounding the conscience of other believers, you start sinning against Christ. So there was some weight that he was having to deal with some of this. So Paul in this section goes on to make a statement that evidently only the people in Corinth understood. And that phrase, that statement is because of the angels. So what do you think? What is that? Because of the angels. A woman should have her head covered because of the angels, and she should have a sign of authority on her head because of the angels. What is he talking about? What have you heard? And what have you maybe come up with your own understanding of what that phrase is referring to? A lot of discussion and commentaries and a lot of confusion. That's why I said evidently only the Corinthians really knew what Paul was actually talking about here. We haven't been given a clarity of it in this passage. Some commentators through the years have said that there were fallen angels that would see a woman's head uncovered and want to have sex with her. Yeah, the whole thing of, and it goes all the way back, some people have used the passage in Genesis where the sons of God came into the daughters of men as being the sons of God being fallen angels, that demons were having sex, or what they call that, incubus, with women. And you can see how this type of belief could really lead to, mercy, ladies, if you don't have your hair long and don't wear a hat, you're going to have a demon chasing you, trying to have sex with you. There's really something wrong with you if a demon wants to have sex with you. I mean, can you see how, and that has been a legitimate teaching of this passage over from some quarters. There were some other interpretations to, that there were, angels in service. And they were offended by women with uncovered head. Makes about as much sense as the first one. But these are what, evidently smart people have tried to come up with this.
Do you not think maybe it's more of an issue positional?
Okay, tell me some more about that.
In other words, the way God has ordained that position. Notice I'm saying position. Woman is under man. Just like we as believers are under Christ. Christ positionally is submissive to the authority of God. And of course the angels are positionally submissive to God himself.
So then the inference would be that just as angels not are, but acknowledge, and we'll just say role for lack of a better term, women should do the same. Yeah, okay. And that's a good way of looking at it. A lot of different ways of looking at it. I think this would fall a lot in line with what Paul has already been talking about. What else have you heard about this? Have you heard this passage ever preached on? You probably would hear it more in more of the conservative Pentecostal denominations, trying to make sure that women understand that you're supposed to have long hair, not wear pants, not wear jewelry and all this other stuff they come up with. This passages like this is where they come up with this, with the real conservative denomination. It's an inconsistency with Scripture, but that's where they come up with it. And I like that. I like that one. One other one that I also like, and once again, the Corinthians were the only ones who evidently really understood what Paul was talking about. Because he doesn't really go into it. He assumes that they understand this point. And evidently it's not terribly important for us to understand because he doesn't go into any further explanation. But I saw one other teaching on this, is that as in Isaiah 6, where the angels in the vision where Isaiah saw the Lord high and lifted up, and there were the angels, and with their wings they covered themselves. So this is referring that in the same vein of, and it really would join in with this one, that in the same vein of the angels being submissive to God, even though they are powerful beings, they have great power and authority and do things, but when they're before God, they make sure that it's not their glory that's being seen. So women in the same way should not make their worship look more like they are promoting themselves than God. Same thing would go the same thing with this idea of the positional role. I think those make the best sense to me of what Paul was talking about. So,
And the woman here, I think, is analogous to the church, or the bride of Christ.
yeah, I can see that being a part of the bigger picture with that. Yeah. Questions? Comments? I know I can feel the wheels turning out there. So,
I've just never worried about offending an angel in my life.
yeah, I mean, you know, when you put it up in purple and white, you know, you wonder, okay, that really does look stupid, doesn't it? But there are people who actually believe that. And of course, they would probably go to Peter's writings where angels have desire to look into the things of salvation and all this other stuff. And they build their little doctrine, once again, going back to making sure that we keep the woman looking as plain as we can make them so that we guys can look at much better. That's the other side of that inference that comes with that.
As you said earlier, I think this series of passages in Corinthians is more of a cultural issue.
To me, it really is.
It doesn't really apply. It doesn't apply at all doctrinally today for us.
No, the only principle, the only thing that really applies out of this is the principle of making sure you glorify God in your worship, not yourself. That's the principle that comes out for us today as we look at this passage. So let's think about that a little bit further. How do we look at a passage like this in today's society? Is Paul saying we should have some kind of appearance rules in our church? Is this a door to legalism in some way? If not, how should we look at this passage?
I think it kind of goes to motive today. I mean, you can have a motive to be seen by others when you worship, or your motive can be just be serving the Lord or worshiping Him. But I think our motive can either support that principle or not.
I think very much motive has something to say about this. And I think I referred to this last week where Jesus told the Pharisees when they would be seen standing in the corners of the street with their hands raised, praying, which, you know, nothing wrong with that, except their motive was to be seen rather than to worship. And the Lord told them, He said, you know, you've already got your reward for that too. In other words, there won't be a reward in heaven for that. Yeah.
Would you call that eye service?
Yeah, eye service. Yeah, that's a good way of looking at it. And I think this is where we get to the principle that comes out of this. What do we want people to look at when we are in a public worship service? What do we want them to take away? How we looked, and how we sounded, and how we conducted ourselves, or how we pointed them to Jesus Christ. Now, don't look at this passage as a suppressant to worship. I don't think Paul is trying to do this. I think what he's really wanting to do is, what is your focus? For the Corinthians in particular, he was having to say, what is your focus? Are you trying to promote yourself as you stand and pray and prophesy? Because remember, he said earlier on, he didn't have a problem with women being, and men and women both, being involved in praying and prophesying. He doesn't address that at all here. So that's not the issue. Is what are you projecting?
I think that's a fine line, though, because in some of the churches we've been to, just like, you know, they say, come as you are, wear whatever you want to.
I think so.
I mean, I don't think, personally, I don't think God cares what we wear in church, as long as it's modest and decent. But,
Which goes back to motive too.
which goes back to motive, yeah.
Why are you?
Yeah.
We can explain this, we're sitting here Southern Baptist, have you ever been to a Catholic wedding? I'm not picking on the Catholic, have you?
Yeah.
Have you ever heard the preacher so drunk you couldn't understand what he's saying? That's fine.
It wasn't a Catholic, but I've been to one where the preacher was drunk.
I couldn't understand, I said, what did he just say?
And the bride was having to tell the preacher, hurry up and get through this, you know. Yeah, I did attend one like that one
Falling
time.
off the stage and stuff?
Yeah. Yeah. So I think that really goes to that what comes out of this passage, because it's so easy to cross the line between we're just trying to glorify God to, okay, we're going to dictate how you should look. No, that's not what Paul is saying. Now, if there is something that clearly, such as the drunk preacher, that clearly identifies one with pagan or sinful activities, then no, we need to have a standard that no, you don't do that. Not here, you don't do that.
I think it comes down to you have to give your best towards God. So the way you dress to church, my best may not be the same as somebody else can afford. So as long as we're giving our everything, our best towards God and everything that we do, whether it's the way we dress to church or what we do in tithing, everything we give our best, then that's all I ask.
Because we have to remember that in the Corinthian congregation, there were people who were patrons. In other words, they had wealth at such a level that they could sponsor people and organizations and things. They had a lot of money. At the same time, there were slaves in that congregation who didn't have the right to even choose what they were going to wear. It was whatever was provided for them. So I don't think Paul is just dictating and saying, well, you've got to look like this type of person. I think it's motive. It is the message that you're trying to send, particularly with the veil for women. In that day, a woman who had a veil on signified she was a married woman. Women who had the veil off or lifted, it was understood. It was a cultural thing, but it was understood. This woman is on the prowl. Even though she's married, she's on the prowl. And some adulteresses would have no veil at all, and maybe would have had their head shorn, so their hair would be really short, which was a sign that they had been punished by society for their adultery. And Paul is saying, you don't want this message to go out. You don't want the implication being. You don't want people to walk away with the wrong understanding of your church. And I think that's where it gets to us for today. What do we want people to leave our congregation with? What is it that we want them to take away from being in our presence? James talked about it in his book. He said that if a man comes in who has the decoration, he says a gold ring, but he comes in and it's obvious from his appearance that he is a rich man, and you tell him, you sit down right here up front. You get the choice seat, but you tell one of the other people who don't have the money, you get out of the way. James says, that's wrong. You can't do that. So I think that's where he's coming. What is the message we're trying to send? What is the implication? Within our society in America, we're very much focused on it's my hair, it's my skin, it's my body, it's my whatever, and I have the right to do with it as I want. Well, just because we can doesn't necessarily mean we ought. Paul has already talked about that in chapters before this section here. So we have to understand what is it that we're projecting. Are we projecting a humility that is similar to the angels? That even angels do not want their glory to be the main thing seen in the presence of God. They want His glory. Are we projecting the same?
But Bill,
Yes, sir.
understanding that I'm getting out of this, are you gonna be a follower of Jesus, or you just gonna be a fan?
Yeah.
You understand what I'm trying to say?
Yeah.
Just like he told one of the guys, told him to follow him, but he said, yeah, go on and take care of this and his brother, then he'll come back.
Yeah. He said, let the dead bury the dead, you come follow me. Yeah. Yeah. And I think that's what Paul is trying to get at. That in our worship services, in public worship services, what is it that we are showing to the people who come in, to our fellow believers, to any lost folks, weak Christians, strong Christians, whoever it might be? Are we showing that we are followers of Christ, or are we showing that we are just church people? We're just church people.
Bill, what kind of church do they have? I mean, this is
They had a mess.
this is pre-gospel, right? This is before Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Yeah, Matthew may have been written before this, but probably,
and
Paul is one of the
so
earliest.
what did church even look like? I mean, they had house churches?
Yeah,
Did they have a building?
most
I mean,
probably
they had
not.
Jewish synagogues.
Yeah, most
So-
of them house church.
Yeah, just house
Yeah,
churches.
just house churches. So that's interesting what might be going on in a small group of people that he's having to address.
Mhm. Yeah, he's not talking 1,000-member congregation here.
I mean, he's not talking about a building like this.
No.
He's just talking about when they come together to worship in small groups, right?
Yeah. Yeah. That we should make sure that we're not sending mixed signals or a message of that rebelliousness, which would go into some of this role stuff that we've talked about. That rebelliousness is part and parcel of Christianity. This is one of the reasons Paul was very, very careful in the early days of the church to encourage people. You know, try to live under the radar of government. He didn't want the Roman government to see Christianity as a competing entity, because he knew what the result of that would be: unnecessary persecution. He said, pray for kings and those in authority. Nero was on the throne. Pray for Nero, that we may lead a peaceable and quiet life in all godliness. We still do our work of evangelism, but try to fly under the radar of the man who claims to be God, which goes against our whole idea in our country of democracy, of being able to demonstrate. And I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, but at the same time, recognize what you're really trying to accomplish. What is the real goal? Who are you trying to glorify here? So, Paul evidently figured that some people would have some trouble with verses 7 through 10, because in verse 11 through 16, he balances any misunderstanding. He says, in the Lord, however, woman is not independent of man, nor is man independent of woman. It's interesting that that verse is never quoted when people start talking about the roles of men and women. They just end it. For as woman came from man, so also man is born of woman. So we can't just say one's greater than the other, because we're both dependent on each other for existence. But everything comes from God. That goes back to, who are you projecting? And then he says, judge for yourselves. And this is where I think he sets it within this cultural context. He says, judge for yourself. And look at the words. Is it proper for a woman to pray to God with her head uncovered? Does not the very nature of things, that's once again customary, does not the very nature of things teach you that if a man has long hair, it is a disgrace to him, but that if a woman has long hair, it is her glory, for long hair is given her as a covering? If anyone wants to be contentious about this, we have no other practice, nor do the churches of God. So, there are several different interpretations of these verses as to how it's applied. The one that appeals to me as making the most sense within the context is customs of a given society. And as Paul does not give a definition of what is long and what is short, I think that he's really looking at that for your area, you need to look at the custom. Not that custom dictates what is scriptural and not scripture, but be able to adapt your understanding of scripture so that the message you present will also fit in within the limitations. Once again, chapter 5, when he's talking about incest, he's not talking about culture. He doesn't care about culture. Kick the guy out. He's very clear with that. So, social custom, which in this case was quite prevalent in the Mideastern world, stated what lost mankind saw as relating to their world, idolatry. And the principle of Scripture is that you do not worship other gods as spiritual beings like the Old Testament God. The actions of believers that in public worship didn't clearly differentiate the worship of Jesus Christ from paganism needed to be avoided. We need to be sure that what we present in our worship doesn't just look like what the world does. Now that can go into a lot of different directions, y'all. But I think that's the principle that we have to abide. I'm thinking of some discussions I've heard around music in churches and stuff like this. One gentleman told me some years ago that while a band was playing in church, he just couldn't stand that rock and roll music, and he wasn't going to be a part of it. He wouldn't even go into the sanctuary. And all of us listen to, what is it, 106.9 and 94.1, and most of that is Southern rock gospel. There are some churches in our area, large churches, very large churches, that you'll hear the music before you ever get in the building. Because I've been to those churches. You could hear it way out in the parking lot. That's how loud it is. They have their reason for doing that. That wasn't something that I liked. I didn't like to have an idea of having to cover my ears just to be able to tolerate, it makes sense to me. It just didn't make sense. I didn't say it was wrong or right. It just didn't make sense.
What?
Didn't say it was wrong or right, huh? Yeah. By the time you got through listening to that, it'd be like that sometimes, especially if you sat close. So there's a lot of this that can come out, but we have to understand that we're not trying to dictate. We're not trying to suppress. We're not trying to judge somebody by our personal feelings. Rather, what is glorifying God? We cannot just act in any way and think God accepts that. I think that's the point that Paul is trying to get these Corinthians to look at here. Other questions or comments on this?
In my mind, how you're relating this to a experience I had at work this week, interviewing a candidate for a job. They came in very inappropriately dressed. And then so after the interview, we were talking, and somebody asked me, well, would you not hire them just because of the way they're dressed? And I had to ask myself, I'm like, well, no, not necessarily, but that sends all these red flags, makes you question, lots and lots of things. So we did not hire this candidate. And it's the same thing as you come into church, you see somebody, And it doesn't mean that they're a good person, bad person, Christian, but in our minds, because we're so influenced by our culture and our upbringing, it does make you question those kinds of things. And I think this is what it's like, don't make them question.
Yeah.
You know, not that that's wrong, that's right.
Yeah.
You know, in her mind, she may have been perfectly fine, but as a culture, like what you wear to a job interview, it was not. Same thing as like what you wear to church. It might be fine, but it makes people, and you don't want your witness to be questioned.
Right. You don't want your witness to be questioned. And there's your point. That, you know, once again, there were rich people in that congregation, there were slaves. Obvious differences in their appearance. But that wasn't the problem. What are you trying to project? What is your witness? What is your witness? That's the issue that Paul was trying to get them to see. What is it that people will see by how we present our worship publicly? If we present it in a pagan way, then people who are lost will see it just, we're no different. What are we glorifying? What are we pointing out? Our abilities or the God who gave us the abilities? And it's a fine line. It's a fine line. It's a very fine line. You want to make sure that we're not promoting ourselves, but we're promoting Jesus Christ. And that's an individual thing, but at the same time, when you're in a public worship service, it takes on a little different flavor. Now, other questions? It's about quarter after, and I'm just wondering whether I want to get into the Lord's Supper deal. Here? Yes, sir.
That reminds me when Jesus told one of the disciples that when he told them that birds have nests and foxes have holes, but he has no word to lay his head. What was he saying? I'm not trying to think I'm praising it.
No.
But he's saying that regardless of what people think or whatever you want to follow me.
Yeah. Yeah. And that if you follow me, you may very well end up like me without anywhere to live on this earth. And that's
Joel.
Oh, yeah. 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 I was thinking Prophet Joel. I'm just running through the book. I'm thinking, I don't remember reading that. Yeah, but Big Smiley. Yeah, Big Smiley, that would be different. Yeah. Yeah. But the point's well taken that even Abraham, after he had lived in Canaan for 40 years, when his wife died, he went to the people of the land and he said, I'm a stranger. He'd been there for 40 years. We don't have a permanent place here on earth. That's what will differentiate. When we get into the study of Revelation, that's one of the phrases. When it talks about people of earth, the phrase actually is earth dwellers. These are people whose whole life is concerned about earth. No sense of heaven, or even hell for that matter. Earth is the only thing that's important. Earth dwellers. And we don't. And as we follow the Lord, there may very well be times where we will end up without a place because of our testimony. We're going to get into the Lord's Supper when we get back into this. I will not be here next week. I will be visiting my daughter. And Kelly will have a lesson for you next week. Maybe it'll be something easier to understand than what I've been dealing with. I don't, but I'll be back the next week.
We studied the entire of this reading right here, what they were.
Yeah. Good luck. We'll see you next week.